So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to forego using a slideshow because I have a lot of small topics that I want to show. So rather than going through slides, I've got some notes for myself on another screen, and I'm just going to go ahead and take you through a whole lot of topics, actually. I came up with nearly 30 of them that I want to cover. Some of them are really small, and some of them are a little bit larger. And so what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to focus on things that folks just don't seem to know about AscentialTest. And we know that here in support because we're constantly showing people things and they're like, well, how do you know that? Like, how would I know that? And some things are, hard to describe in documentation, or they're buried somewhere in documentation and not easy to find. So if you've taken a class, then you might know it, but if you've never taken a class, it just might be something that you've missed. So I'm going to try to bring those things out. And as always, a day or so after we have this webinar will actually be posted on YouTube as well. So if there's colleagues of yours that haven't been able to make this this time, they'll be able to watch it, or you can always watch it again later. So I'm going to go ahead and start right in. I've divided the presentation into two sections. There's things about the user interface that I'm going to be highlighting in the first part of the presentation. And then the second part of the presentation is going to be more about Z. And so most of the stuff is in the UI, but I have some really interesting things I want to show you about Z as well. So the first thing I want to show you is very simple. You see my AscentialTest here in the middle of the screen. And what I want to show you is that, you've got an order to your subtabs inside of AscentialTest. And pretty much all of our workspaces will have subtabs. There's two subtabs here. There's two subtabs here. As many files as I open, I'm going to have subtabs. There's a number of them here. If I don't like the order of them, because they basically, if you open up a new file or a new object, it's always going to put it on the right, but maybe that's not the way you want it. All you have to do is just take your mouse and drag, and if you watch, there's a little black arrow that shows up. I can't point to it with my mouse because I don't have two mouses, but if you look between the first tab and the second tab right now, you see a tiny black arrow because I dragged and then I let it go. I'll do it again just so that you can see it. Watch for that. Let's see the little black arrow. It just showed up. It's between tabs 1 and tabs 2. And that's just an indicator of the position that you're going to drag it. Because I just dragged it one position, but I could drag it more than one position. And you'll see that little black arrow is sort of like an insertion point where I'm about to drop the tab. So again, a simple little feature, but it's useful because if you want things in a certain order, maybe you've got your snapshots in an order and maybe you're not using a series, but you want to order them, you can do that. The next thing I want to talk about is something that can drive me crazy sometimes, frankly, and you may have experienced this as well. And what I'm talking about is this panel here, and I'm going to expand it a little bit so that we have a lot of objects, and and I've expanded those objects. So what I want to do is I want to talk about this business of auto scroll. And I'm going to use select employee. So let me find that snapshot. So bear with me a moment while I find it. Here it is. I've got this snapshot, and I've already got select employee defined. But I'm doing that on purpose because here's what I want to show you. So, if I wanted to do a drag, for example, to the bottom, it can be really hard to do when you've got, a lot of objects already defined and you've already got something on the bottom. When you go to drag to the bottom, it can be really tricky to try to get to the bottom. In fact, a lot of times, it's not doing it right now, but a lot of times what will happen is AscentialTest will scroll. It'll start to try to scroll things into view. Oh, I know why, because I was playing with it and I turned it off. And so, so you go to try to drag something, and all of a sudden you'll find that AscentialTest grabs the scroll bar from you, and it makes it very difficult for you to get it into the place that you want to get it into. So I have a little trick that I do. What I do is I turn off auto scroll, and I come down to the bottom, and I actually just add a couple of lines. So I add a couple of lines, and I actually put my insertion, or I select that particular line. Then when I go to drag, AscentialTest will not try to scroll at all. You'll always be able to get something new dragged over to the bottom. You won't get any of that scrolling behavior, because a lot of times what happens is you go to drop it and all of a sudden the scroll bar goes up to something that maybe AscentialTest is matching and you're not able to get it down the bottom. But that's a very simple little trick. Just add a couple of empty nodes, select one of them, turn off auto scroll, and then just drag, and you won't ever have that problem of AscentialTest trying to scroll something into view. I also want to point out that the elements tree has that same auto scroll checkbox right here. And so a lot of times what happens when we're looking at the elements tree is, we might be studying something and we might be several levels deep. But then if we get over, to AscentialTest and maybe we accidentally click, or sometimes just hovering, what will happen is AscentialTest will scroll whatever you've clicked on or hovered on into view, and then you will have lost whatever it was that you were working on. So again, we added this a couple of years ago. We added the ability to turn off the auto scroll so that when you click, you notice when I click now, it's not going to try to get anything into view. If it's there, it'll highlight it, but it won't scroll it into view. So those are the auto scroll checkboxes, and that's what those things are for, so that AscentialTest won't try to match whatever it is that you've got here in your snapshot. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is configuring workspaces. This is something I've been surprised people don't know about. There's a couple of icons up here in the upper right-hand corner. And the first icon, this little gear, what it does is it allows me to select based on my current workspace. So I'm in the Data Tables workspace. And by default, the Data Tables workspace contains only data tables. That's kind of like plans. Plans only includes plans. Test sets only includes test sets. App objects only includes app objects. Tests is a little different because tests can include both steps and tests and app states. But most of the other ones, there's only one type or one object type that you have in a workspace. But sometimes it's convenient to be able to look at something from another workspace. And the way to do that is to click on the gear and then decide, well, right now I also want to be able to look at plans while I'm in my data tables workspace. You can choose any of the other workspaces. Basically what it does is it splits it so that I can see both my plan and my data table. And the way I toggle it once I've decided what I want to show is just by clicking on this second icon. So it's really pretty convenient to be able to see a plan when you're building the data for that plan. Because often plans will describe the different instances, for example, of a test. And those instances usually mean that there's a different row of data. So I can look at what I've designed in my test and then create my data accordingly by looking, across. We're more familiar with that, I think, here in this workspace because AscentialTest does automatically put you in the split mode when you're in the test workspace because we so often have a snapshot open when we're dealing especially with steps. I'm not sure about your habits, but my habits are that when I've got a test open in my test workspace, I will often have a snapshot. But a lot of times when I have a test open instead, I don't need the snapshot, so I don't want to lose the screen space, so I'll toggle that off. So that may be new to some folks. Maybe you all already know about that one. Now, another thing I want to talk about is the project library. I've been a little surprised lately that a lot of folks seem to think that you can only have one file for your tests, one for your steps, one for your app objects. I've actually got two already, but that's actually artificial. Now, we ship the product that way because we want to give new users a starting point so that they do have a place to put their steps and a place to put their tests and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that that's a restriction or a limitation in AscentialTest, because if you're on a team and you're under source control, you really wouldn't want to have one file for all your steps and one file for all your tests, because if you did that, then there'd be a lot of contention for those few files. And we have quite a few customers where you have large teams. So what we recommend is that you have many step files, many test files, many app object files. And how you divide that is really up to you. Sometimes you do it by module or by feature. But the idea is that so when a member of a team needs to add a step or modify a step and they lock that specific steps file, they're not locking everybody else out of all the step files or all the test files. So strongly recommend that if you haven't divided your project up, that you do so. And it's not a difficult thing to do. You just create another file, and then you can just copy and paste into it in order to get your project organized the way you want to. Here's something else that I've discovered folks don't know about. This app objects view here is something that maybe a lot of us don't pay that much attention to, because we're often over here when we're working on our app objects. But and I have to be honest, I forgot about this feature myself until relatively recently. If you have an app object over here and you want to locate it, if you've only got one file, well, maybe it's not that hard. You could collapse it all, and then you can look for it, or you can go over here and do a find and find it. But what's even easier is just to come over here and double click it and watch what happens. When I do that, the app object for the about box was actually not in the file that I had loaded here. I had loaded, I'll do it for you again, I had loaded the app objects file, but the definition for the about dialog is not in this particular app object file. It's in another one. But when I click it, we not only locate the file, but we actually highlight the object for you as well. So that's a useful thing to be able to do. And you might know this already, but you can alphabetize them, or you can organize them by file. And so here they're in the app objects file versus in the about file. Okay, so you can decide how you want to organize them. again, I had actually forgotten about that feature until relatively recently. Something else I want to talk about that maybe a lot of folks don't know about. There's these checkboxes up here that allow you to do matched, versus unmatched. And depending on, the colors that you use in your own application, that can be very useful or not very useful. Sometimes if you've got a lot of color, it's not that easy when you click on this versus this. What we're basically showing you here is that if you've got a definition for a page, a screen, whatever, and you want to know what have I defined and what have I not defined, especially if you've got like a busy screen, or maybe you've got a new version of your application and maybe a couple of fields were added, something like that. What you could do is you could say, well, what have I already matched? And what we do is we highlight whatever you've matched in green that kind of matches the color of the, the green check mark or number if it's a class. Whereas if you want to say, well, what haven't I matched yet? You can click on this and you can see that we haven't defined this area down here. So matched and unmatched can be useful to decide, to determine whether or not there's something on the page that you haven't yet defined. Now I want to talk about the test plans. I'm going to go over to our plans workspace, and I'm going to open up, let's see, I've got demo plan here. And there's actually a few things I want to do in the plan. So I know that most folks, I think, probably work in update mode, where they put in their detail of their plan, and then they drag a test, whether it be an automated test or a manual test. You see I've got one of each here, blue T for manual test, green T for automated test. I drag them over to the plan. But this insert mode is a little bit different because, it's not always a situation where you're going to develop a plan. Maybe you're going to do some just kind of ad hoc testing or whatever, and you're going to drag some tests over today and run them. But maybe you don't want to spend the time developing a plan. And so, you can be in this insert mode and you can drag and drop. But what I want to show you is that whether or not you get the name of the plan, of the test, I'm sorry, versus the description of the test, that's up to you. And there's a switch inside of runtime options that will do that. So let me drag over and I'll show you. So we've got a test called casting. Let me just collapse here and collapse here and go over here to my seminar folder. So if I drag over casting example, you notice that I got something that doesn't look like the name of a test, right? It isn't actually. It's not the name of the test. It's actually the description of the test. And what controls whether or not I get the name of the test or the description of the test is here in project settings. So if I go to project settings and I go to runtime options, I'm sorry, if I go to other, there's a checkbox that says always use the name in the plan. So if I check that and then I click OK, and then I drag over the casting, notice the difference. Here, I get the name of the test, not the description of the test. Okay, so if you're not creating test plans, but maybe you want your descriptions to show, so that could sort of be in lieu of writing a test plan. And just to remind everybody, that description comes from right here. So when you're creating your test, you're giving it a description, casting example. And so you can see that's where that description came from. Whereas this was not from the description, this was from the name of the test. And the name is up here. So the name versus the description. And again, what controls that is your project settings other, whether or not you have this checkbox checked or not. Okay. Now, another thing that I often forget, you can control the size of the font and the font face itself using Options, Font. And you can see that it's by editor. So the compilers panel, the data table editor, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and select the Plan Suite editor since that is what we're in right now. And I'm just going to change that. And again, I can change to, I'm just randomly checking something, see? So you can change the font and the type. That can be important, when you're, say, on a laptop. I have a tiny laptop. That's not what we're on right here, but I have a tiny laptop that I often use, very small screen. And so, being able to change the font and change the size of the font is pretty useful. Next, I want to talk about another option that I think maybe a lot of people don't know about. And so let me get a step here. And let's see my steps. Just going to collapse a few things here so that it makes it easier for me to get around. I created a folder for everything that I want to show you this morning. So I'm going to open up this, oops, that's not the one I want. I want demo on Verify, yeah. So I've got a purchase order here. Let me just go to my purchase order. So new order, but I don't have an order loaded because I'm purposely trying to create an error. And so what I want to show you is another configuration in the project settings. There's something called, create a snapshot on a verify error. And so you notice here the way I've got it, and I did run it ahead, but I'm going to run it for you again. So if I run this, it's going to get an error because I'm expecting this address in the field, in the address field, but there isn't anything in the address field because I don't have a customer loaded. So I'm purposely creating an error right now. But what I want to show you is that if I go over to project settings and I go to the runtime options, I can say log snapshot when a verify fails. If I click that and I click OK, and I am doing a verify, and I run it again, you notice that then we actually do create an error snapshot. And of course, I think probably everyone knows that if I then double click on the error snapshot, I will get a chance to see what the screen looked like. Now, of course, in my case, I didn't do a set active, so it's not a terribly useful snapshot since AscentialTest is sitting there. But you get the idea. So toggling that, again, project settings, runtime defaults, toggling that checkbox will control whether or not we automatically capture a snapshot when you use one of our verifies. Okay. There are other verifies that you drag and drop over where you can, I think there's a switch that allows you to determine whether or not, like I think verify value does that. Let's see, does it? Yeah, so verify value does that too. So if I was using a verify value and I said, you know, I'm expecting A and I got B, and if they don't match, log a snapshot. So that you get to control there whenever you use the verify value. But this is a universal switch. So whenever you're using a verify, you don't have to worry about individual verifies. You can just turn that on or turn that off. Okay. Again, I think that's quite useful, and maybe not everyone knew about that. Okay, now I want to talk about test ID. There's the ability in AscentialTest that maybe not everybody knows about. If you go up to project settings again, and you go to test identifier, there's the test identifier tab in the project settings. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to enable the test ID feature in our test plans. And when I enable it, I can then configure what I want the project ID to look like. And this is a unique ID. So it creates something that will be unique to the project. It uses the project ID, the plan ID, and then the node ID. The project ID and the plan ID are items that you set. The node ID is something that we generate automatically, and it never changes. Even if you delete or add new tests to a plan, we won't change the node ID. So you can always be assured that that's going to stay the same. The customer that asked for this feature, I know they used it because they actually discussed test cases in meetings, and the way to discuss it is by giving it an identifier. Again, project ID, plan ID, and node ID. And I know other customers have since adopted that as well. But it has another feature, and that's really what I want to focus on right now. So now you know about that, and I will show you briefly where you do add those things. If you go to project data, you will see the project ID shows up as soon as you enable that feature. And if I went over to one of my plans, I could see that in plan data, it also shows up, the plan ID. Again, the node ID is generated automatically. So you see the 001 here, the 005. You know, they're not going to be in order because, again, I've added and deleted from this particular plan. And like I said, that's never going to change. But what you can do is that you can then use the query. You can go to mark by query, and you can then use the ID. And I've got the wrong plan open, so let me open up the right plan first so that I can show you this. So let's see, so test ID, and I'm going to use, in this case, I'm going to use a test set called seminar test set. So here's my seminar test set. These all have these IDs, and you can see the test IDs here. And by the way, they show up in the attributes panel. So in a way, a test ID doubles as an attribute. And so what I can do is I can then go up to my mark menu and say mark by query. And I set this up ahead of time, but I created a query called test ID. And I say this is the test ID where the test ID is PBUS. So there's the project, there's the plan. And then I'm saying, but I want all the nodes in this plan. Because remember, my test sets can be made up of many, many plans or many, many plans and suites. So it will mark all of the tests based on the test ID. Now I want to show you a couple of features that I have a feeling not a lot of people know about. There is something called find steps, and then there's something else called query tests, and they're kind of related. So let me talk about those. So for find steps, I'm going to use a test that I've created called empty test. So let me go over here to my test, and I'm going to open up empty test. I don't need this right now. I've got empty test. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up find steps. And the way that I do that is I go over to my steps and I right click and I say find steps. Now, what find steps allows me to do is it allows me to locate steps in my step library based on a name or a partial name. So, and I've got, you know, the ability to put in wildcards like question marks or the asterisk for more than one character. So let's see. So I am going to say verify star. And then if I do a find, you see what it does is it finds all of the steps that have the word verify in them. And then since I've got my test here, I can just take and drag and drop. I notice that we don't yet allow multiple selection in this one, whereas in find tests, query tests, you can. And actually, I found what I think is a defect here because I'm quite sure that some of these descriptions, these verifies have description. I've got to look into that. I noticed that when I was preparing for this demonstration. So find steps, again, very useful for locating steps based on, you know, a name or a partial name. Now there's something kind of similar for tests. And so it's called query tests. And I'm going to use my demo plan, which I've got here. And let me just make a little room. So here we go over to the tests, and I right click and I say query tests. And queries work on attributes, which I will show you in a minute, because some people, when I've showed them this, they're like, oh, I've never even noticed that tests have attributes. So I will show you that. But before I do, I just want to show you how the query mechanism works. So I've got a query here, but let me show you how I got that query. You click on edit, and this might look a little bit familiar because it's very similar to mark by query. In fact, I think it's the same thing as mark by query. You select your attribute, then you select your operator, and then you select your value. And they can become complex because you have ands and ors and things like that. This is a very simple query, and that's most of the time what you're going to do. But you can have very complex queries. So that's how that works. Once you have a query and it's displayed here and you click execute, then you see that you know, anything that matches the query will be displayed. And here you actually I can either use the control character to select multiples, or I can use the shift character. And then when I drag, notice it says 3 tests, and I let it go, and I've got the 3 tests that it found. Now let me just show you where that attribute is, because you might be wondering, well, wait a minute, I don't even know anything about test attributes. Where do you set the attribute in a test? Everybody knows about the attributes for plans, but I think maybe not everybody knows about the fact that tests actually have attributes as well. It's sitting right there in plain view. We're very, very familiar with the parameters panel, but we often overlook the fact that we have an attributes panel right here. And so you notice here I've got my attributes P1, I've got my priority set. These attributes are shared between tests and test plans. It's the same attribute system that you're probably accustomed to when you add attributes to your project. Those attributes can be used here on the attributes panel of your test, or they can be used here in the attributes panel of your plan. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about a new feature, actually, new to Power Builder. It's been there for web for quite a while, but we just discovered a need for this in Power Builder. So let me get set up to do that for you. Bear with me for a moment. Yeah. Oh, wait, did I skip one? Hang on. Nope, I didn't. Path generation. Okay, so we're going to use customer maintenance in sales. Okay, so let me find that snapshot. Here we go. And here's customer maintenance. Now, I want to show you something. And you might have seen this in your own application. If I go to drag this table over and whoops, that didn't work. There we go. If I try to drag this table open, that didn't work out so well. And the reason is that AscentialTest tried to use some render text, but it wasn't really connected in a way that whatever it tried to use, it didn't come up with a good unique path. And so what I can do, and this is only got put in the last release. So this is new to 9.8. So if you don't know about it, it's because it's new. You go up to your project settings and you go to path generation. And if you're not familiar with path generation, you should read up on it. I'm not going to cover it in this seminar other than what I'm showing you, but it is very useful for prioritizing which types of attributes are used to create paths. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to PB table. So I'm in project settings, path generation, PB table, and I'm going to turn off render text. That's basically saying to AscentialTest, don't use render text when defining tables. And so now when I drag it over, it won't use render text. It's going to use visible objects instead. And now we got a nice definition of our table. Okay. Prior to putting in that feature, what customers were having to do is they're having to learn how to define their class and their tables manually. So you were always able to get around the issue, but once we discovered what was going on, we allowed you to turn it off. We don't want to turn it off entirely because sometimes render text is a very useful way to develop a path. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about other files. Like I said in the beginning of this presentation, I'm all over the place in this demonstration because I've just tried to find things about AscentialTest that I think some of you might not know. Other files is a way to have a file delivered to the place where the test is executing. And this takes maybe a little bit of explaining. When a test is executed in AscentialTest, it doesn't really just run on the local machine. It always runs in something that we call the run folder. It doesn't run in the project folder. It's not where the project was defined. And the reason for that is that you don't always run AscentialTest on the local machine. Sometimes you run it on a remote machine. Sometimes you're running it on multiple remote machines at the same time. The place that we're actually running is here on this local machine. It's in the Options Open App Data folder. You will find a run folder, and you'll find this on remote machines as well. And you see AscentialTest actually delivers the project to the run folder. And part of the project is the other folder. It delivers the other folder as well, along with your, your rendered images and your baseline images and things like that. So this folder is a good way to deliver something to the place where the test is going to be run. So in this case, I've just got this little thing called mydata.ini. And again, this was just to give you an example. I've got an ini file that has a test and a message. And so that message will always be available to me at runtime, so that if I have something that I want to read at runtime, I can do that. I can always be assured that that is going to be delivered to the place that I want to run. However, it's not going to be persistent. So what that means is you don't want to update that file and expect that the next test case will get what you just updated. That isn't how it works. It's delivered from the project to the test, and it can't be updated between tests. There's other ways to do that, but it's not using the other files. Okay. If you want to talk about that, you can contact us. We've helped a lot of people build incrementers and things like that that are persistent between tests, but this is not one of them. Okay, now I want to talk about got a particular snapshot here. Yeah. I want to talk about something that I think a lot of us don't know. Sometimes there's an object on a page. You see this a lot on the web, but you see it in Power Builder too, where it's on the page, but you can't see it. For whatever reason, it's been hidden by the developer. But AscentialTest actually can see it. It doesn't show it to us by default. So if we look in the elements tree, we won't see it unless we click this checkbox. And then it does show up, and it shows up, right now I've got it highlighted, so it looks green. It shows up in white. So if I click it, shows up in white. Now, I can define that object, but there's a trick to it. If you're going to define it, you have to go over to match and say hidden. There's also something called ignored and clipped that I'm not talking about right now, but those match up with these other checkboxes here. Ignored is when we ignore it. It's there, but AscentialTest thought we should ignore it in order to remove an unnecessary level. But you can bring those back in as well by clicking, and you see they all come in. Most of the time we do it correctly, but occasionally we get it wrong, and that's why you need to be able to bring it back by clicking on the ignored. And it works exactly the same way that I just showed you with hidden. So just remember that if you check hidden in order to see it, then check hidden here in your path statement. If you checked ignored, then make sure that you checked ignored. Sometimes they're ignored and hidden. That's why it's not a radio list, why it's a bunch of checkboxes instead. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about your database, your test set database. You go to Options and you go to Database. You notice this button called Config. Well, what Config allows you to do is three things. It allows you to select project attributes, attributes that you've already used in your plans. And here we're talking about plans specifically. And if you want to use those in your test sets for reporting, then you need to be able to check, you need to check them before you create your test sets. So check whatever attributes you want to use, get them into your database before you create your test sets. You can also put in blocked reasons and failure reasons, and these are used in our blocked reason report and our failure reason report. So you can load up those reason codes. Again, do this before you create your test sets. Then once you create your test sets, and by the way, we do always close your test sets whenever you open that dialog box, because we're going to be updating the database that the test set is already attached to. Okay, so here we are in our test set, and the way that I can use those is if I go over to my result and I go to Generate Report, you can see that now I can use whatever attributes I've set as filters. So you know, I can run, say, this report, and I'm filtering it so that I'm only seeing the positive. And so when I generate my report, you'll see that I'm reporting on 23 because I'm only looking at my test type positive, and we show it to you here in the report. If I take that away and I generate the report again, and whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do standard report. So if I remove that, so I'm not filtering anymore, and I run the report, now you see it's reporting on 33 tests because it's not just the positive tests. Okay, so using those attributes allows you to filter your reports. And again, the trick is make sure you get those attributes into your database before you create your test sets. Okay. Now I want to talk about how you can add functions to your projects. So you notice here in my Actions Explorer in this Functions section, normally you only see logging and verification and other. Those are the functions that AscentialTest gives you by default. But you can create your own functions and they become part of your project so that they can be dragged and dropped just like any other function. And so the way that I do that is I come here, I right click and say add function, and the function editor shows up. That's a slightly different editor than a test editor, because a function can have a return, for example, whereas a test and a step cannot. And you can also have both in-out parameters, because functions can have in-out, and in-out parameters. And then, here's some examples of functions that we've created. So using the function editor, as opposed to, say, doing your functions in the library workspace, allows you all the drag and drop features that you have. Plus, of course, you can go into full Z by clicking on the Z icons to put either the line or the whole function in Z. And so then once you do that, those are available to you to drag and drop, just like the ones that are shipped with AscentialTest, no different. Parameters all show up described so that you can see what the names of the parameters are, and so forth. So if somebody on the team develops a new function, it's available to everybody else on the team. Now I want to show you something kind of fun. I don't think a lot of people know that you can use a manual test for more than just manual testing. I've known customers that will purposely put a manual test at the very beginning of their test plan because sometimes they need to be reminded to do something, either to their application or to set something in project data of AscentialTest. And so they do that. They add a test at the beginning of their plan. So watch what happens when I run this plan. Now this has only got this in it, but what happens is this manual dialog pops up and it can do different things. Like in this case, I'm requiring the build number, so I'm gonna have to put the build number in. Maybe that build number is then gonna be written somewhere and used in reporting or something like that. I can pass that step. And then here's my reminder. It says, make sure that you set the project and plan data correctly before continuing. Oops, I forgot. So I'm just going to abort the run, go fix my project data, and then I'm going to run again. This saves you maybe, kicking off a set of tests only to find out that you forgot to do something and the whole, execution is basically useless. Okay, so using a manual step in a way that we actually didn't intend it to be used. That was actually sort of discovered, I think, by a customer at one point. Okay, now I want to talk about capturing snapshots, saving snapshots versus images. So I've got a step, and yeah, I want to show you the difference. So I'll go. Let me explain it first, and then I'll run it for you. So here I'm going to set the purchase order active, and then I'm going to do a capture snapshot, which is going to capture image. It's going to take a picture of the whole screen. I can save snapshot, which means I'm going to save it to a file. I could have done a UI, but I chose to do a purchase order. So it's going to take a snapshot of purchase order .items. So that's what's going to be in the snapshot. Or I could do a log snapshot. The difference is that this saves it to a file, whereas this puts it in your results file. So if I run it, it's going to set it active, and then it's going to It's going to save it. So it saved it to F temp. So if I hit my F5 here. So there's my snapshot. And then there's my image. So the image is just, you know, a PNG. In fact, you notice it's my whole screen, the screen you're viewing and the other screen that's giving me my prompts as I do the presentation. And of course, this one here, you know, if I double click it, then I get to see what the application looked like at runtime. That's the error snapshot that sometimes gets generated automatically by AscentialTest when it can't find an object, for example. Okay, now I want to show you something interesting about the metadata editor, this metadata editor down here. So let me go over to, I'm going to open up an order. So I'm going to open up order 2972. So I've got my order open. And I want to go to demo data type conversions, and this is a step. Okay, so I'm going to run this a couple of times for you, but I want to show you something interesting. So let's go here to, let's see, go to data type conversions, and that would be using purchase order. So let's get our purchase order snapshot here. Here we go, there's purchase order. And I've got a couple of fields here. Item quantity. So where's my item quantity? Bear with me a moment. So we've got purchase order dot items dot item quantity. Where is it? Order total. Purchase order dot items dot row. Here we go. Dot item quantity. So I'm interested in this field here, item quantity. Now by default, this is a string. And you notice that in our metadata, we have the value type of string for item quantity. And so when I run this, what I'm having to do, you'll notice, because it's a string, I'm getting the item quantity. I'm getting the item quantity from the application, but I'm having to parse it because it's a string and put it into a number so that I can then get the total. So I'm going through each item and I'm totaling it up. But every time I want to get the integer, I've got to cast it basically to an integer so that I can total it. And so you can see that, you know, then we get the total of 2. But I don't have to do that because what I can do, let me just comment this section out now. And I'm going to uncomment this section. And I'm going to run it again. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here and I'm going to change this to integer. So I'm changing the value type from string to integer. Then when I run it, this time you notice I don't have to do that because AscentialTest automatically, that's what this metadata does for you, this metadata editor. It automatically converts the string into an integer. And then I get my same total. But I don't have to parse it this time. Okay, one more thing in the user interface. Now, Sandra, I have to ask you a question. I've never gone this long. I have more than I thought. Can we keep going and people will just drop off if they need to, or do I have to cut off and then save this for another time?
You can go on for, let's say, for 10 to 15 minutes, I guess.
Okay, good. I'll easily be able to finish in that amount of time. So I apologize to folks that this took longer than I thought, but I had more to show you than I thought. And again, if you have to drop off because you only allocated an hour, you'll be able to catch the rest of it on YouTube. Okay, so I want to show you now about inserting a null character. This is another thing that I think a lot of people don't know. So what happens when you've got a value in a field in a data table, and then you decide, oh no, I don't want that value? Well, that's not the same. By the way, this just came up in a class, and that's why that I taught over the last couple of weeks, and that's why I decided to add it to this presentation. An empty field is not the same as a null field. A null field has a null value in it, and you can see that tiny little square there. You might have a statement in your test that says, if the value is null, then do this, otherwise do that. That's not going to work in this case if you've accidentally, put some data in there and then removed it. You have to know to hold down the Alt key and hit the N as in Nancy, and then that will put in the null value in that field. So Alt N will put a value back into a data table. This is also true in other places in the user interface where you can have null values. Alt N is the key sequence that you need in order to restore the null value to that field. Okay, so my notes tell me that was 23 things I just told you about the user interface. Now I'm going to switch over, and I've got 5 things that I want to tell you about Z. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about metadata, but not the same metadata that we were just looking at here with the metadata editor. This is actually the metadata that is in AscentialTest itself. So I've got an example for you, and it's a step. Let me find my step. It's called Metadata Example. Now, a little explanation necessary here. Metadata allows you to add information to, well, in this case, your app objects, but it's actually more than that. You can use metadata in other places as well, but I'm going to introduce it being used here in objects. And so in order to show you that, I've got to close my app object file here so that I can open it here. I've created a class called Required Field Indicator. And I've inherited from this built-in thing that we call metadata. Now my class only has one member, and it's a flag called required, be required flag. So this indicates whether a field is a required field or not a required field in my target application. So that's how I create my metadata. Class, name of my metadata class, inheriting from metadata. One member, it's a Boolean, and it's the be required flag. Now I want to show you how I've used it. So I've got a couple of objects here where I've actually used that piece of metadata. And let me see if I can quickly spot them for you so that I can bring them out. There should be an extra line somewhere, so they shouldn't be that hard to find. Let's see. I can find them. I think I made myself a note. Yeah, so then we have to go to new employee. So if we find new employee, we'll find a couple of fields. Here we go, new employee. And you see that I've got a couple of fields here. In this case, for the employee first name field, I've set the flag to true. Whereas in the other field that I've designated, I've set it to false. And that would be, let me find my notes. Let's see if we can find it here. Let's see. So here I've set it to true, set it to true. Here we go. I've set it to false for manager ID. So I've set it for true for these fields, and I've set it for false for this field. Now let me show you how we use it. So here I say if And I'm doing something very fancy here, by the way. I'm using the reference operator, which I actually not going to teach in this seminar, but you can look that up. I can put in, I'm going to test this twice for you. I'm going to pass it in the name of the field that I want to test, the flag. And so if the flag is set, then I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to input a value into this field, whereas otherwise I might skip it. Now here I'm just putting print statements so that you can see it, but you would actually skip it in your case if you were going to use it. So here I'm going to put in first one of the ones that I set it to, name, and you say input value. So in this case, I would actually input a value, whereas if I run it again and I say, I'm going to put in manager ID, it's going to skip it based on the metadata. So metadata can be very useful now that you know about it. Okay, there's something else I want to talk about. I'm going to talk about this function that I always forget about. And sometimes, and I do it the old way manually. So there's demo UA parse. So let me find that. Okay, so I'm going to use this step. I'm going to load a customer into my purchase order. Okay, I've already got one, so that's good. So I've got a customer there already. And so what I can do here is I can put in the name of an object, the name of an app object with a dot in it. So it has a dot in it, and I can click OK. And what AscentialTest will do is it'll handle the fact that I passed in an app object name with a dot in it, and it parsed it into an app object. So I'm basically passing it in as it's an object, but it's got a dot in it, and AscentialTest will then assign it to an app object at runtime. Before we put this in, what you had to do is you had to pass in the pieces, and then you had to build the app object yourself. But parse app object allows you to just pass the whole thing in with the dot, and AscentialTest will handle it for you. So it allows you to pass in an app object that's got its full name, not just the node name at the end, but the full name. Grandparent, parent, child. You can pass the whole thing in, and AscentialTest will handle that for you. Okay, now I want to talk about the system class. This might be a class that might surprise you if you've not used it before. Okay, so the system class has a lot of interesting functions in it. Now, I'm not going to call all of them. I've just picked out some ones that I want you to know about that you might not know about. The first thing the system class allows you to do is call execute, which would be like running something from the command prompt. So for example, if you bring up a command prompt and you put in date, if I just bring up a command prompt and type in date, I will get the current date, and it'll actually then respond with another prompt that will allow me to put in a new date if I want to change the date. So system.execute allows me to do that. Anything that you can call from the command prompt, you can call from within AscentialTest, and the command output will provide you with a list of string. Here's another example. I'm going to try to ping a computer. So I'm pinging, and here's the response that I got. Remember, it passes back a list of string. And so then I can print that list. We also have something called system.run. System.run will allow you to do anything that you can do here from the run box in Windows. So if I run it, this one's going to pop up two notepads because I popped up notepad empty, and then I popped up notepad with build INI. So I'll show you that now. So here I launched build INI. So its default editor is Notepad and in edit mode. And then here I just launched Notepad. So again, anything you can do from run, you can do from within there. Useful to know, I think. If you want to find out whether or not a file exists, you can do that. You see, this file exists. That's the one that I just launched. If you want to get information about all the files in a folder, you can do that. You can get a list of file info. You can get the value of environment variables, registry values. You can get the version of a file. So you see I got the value of Java Home. I got the value of the registry key. I got the version of this particular of our UA server. We're at 9.8. This is really useful here. So let me run it for you and then I'll explain it. Oops. Hang on. Probably I don't have it. Yeah. I need my hook. Okay. So basically what I've done here is I've got this word, and you know, word is, well, it's kind of a custom, it's a bunch of custom objects, but we actually can get the text out of a Word document. But let's just say I want to create a parser. What I can do is I can do a Control A and a Control C. That's why you saw it got highlighted. And that puts it on the clipboard. Puts it on the clipboard, and then you can do a system. We're still in the system class .get clipboard, and you can basically get it into a list of strings, and then you can parse it. And you can see I did that. So I parsed out my name, for example. So this was sort of a combination of using the system.get clipboard and then using our string class in order to parse things. Okay. So sometimes when you want to get strings out of a custom object, this is how you do it. Get it onto the clipboard and parse it. Okay, just a couple more things and then we'll be finished. I want to talk about data store queries. This is, again, something that I'm not sure everybody knows about. I've got a data store example for you. So data stores are kind of interesting. Let me bring in a data table here. And I've got credit cards. So I'm going to run a couple of queries for you. So I'm going to run the first two. So the first one, test credit cards. I actually didn't mean to run both of them. Let me do it again, just so that it's clearer. Here we go. So the first query just dumps basically the data table. So you can see you got each row and you got all the values in the row. Whereas if I do this and run it, I got the third record. I got my Discover card. So that's what the square bracket 3 is. Now here, this is kind of interesting. I can say random, and I'll get a random whereas I can then say, first, and I'm always going to get my first record. Likewise, I could say last and always get my last record. So first, last, random. Here, I'm going to query based on the card ID. So I'm using a column. It's kind of like a where clause, right? Where the card ID equals that. Here, I'm using the same query, but I only want the card number. So here, whereas this gave me the whole row, this gives me just the object in the row. So I say dot card number and I get just the card number. Here I'm using a wildcard. That's the only difference. So I'm using like with a wildcard. And here, the only difference with this one is that I got my queries a little bit more complex. So you can see I'm saying like this and the code equals that, just so that you can see that you can make more complex queries inside of here. Now, eventually we're planning to make this visual because we recognize that, whereas what I've showed you is relatively simple, but if I had inside of my data table maybe a record or a list of record, yes, you can query it, but it gets kind of complicated with all the dots and the square brackets and so forth. So eventually we'll put a visual editor in there like we've done for, mark by query and things like that. Okay, I've got one more thing to show you. Yeah. So I showed you how you can get things into the actions panel by adding functions. Now I want to show you how you can get things into the editor. Let me just get our snapshot back here again. Into the actions panel down here, so that you can drag and drop from here as well. And I've got two examples. The first one is I want to show you how you can extend a class. So I extended the class called PB Pop-Up Table, and I created something called Select with Mouse. And so I did this in the library browser because we don't yet have a method editor. Well, no, extend I would always do here, sorry. It's the next thing I'm going to show you where we need the method editor. Here, I would do it in the library. I say extend class, the name of the class, and then I gave it a new action called Select with Mouse. Now, once I do that, I come over here, and if I find my pop-up, so if I go to purchase order, let me find my purchase order again. Here we go, purchase order, because purchase order has a pop-up. Purchase order, and we have a pop-up. Sales rep is a pop-up. So if I come here, and let me open up my empty step just so that it's not messy. I come down here, you'll see that the new method that I just created is right here, select with mouse. That's what I created right here. So it shows up in AscentialTest as if it was supported by AscentialTest. So again, if someone on your team creates a new action, it will show up here so that it can be dragged and dropped or appended or inserted. And finally, the last thing I want to show you is that you can do the same thing if you want to write a method for an object. And so if we go to our PBU sample and we go to our render text, you'll see that down here I did create something called select path, and I'll show it to you. This is where I think sometime this year we will have an editor where you can add actions to your objects without having to do what I'm doing here. Right now I have to close the app objects and open it here, and then I can do it right here in the Z editor. And if I open up this, you'll see here's that select path that I was talking about. Sometime this year you'll be able to do that, just like you can do the function editor from within right from here. You'll be able to right click and open up the function editor and create your functions. But just like I was able to show them, you know, when I did them in the library, the select with mouse, same thing here. If I come here and I go to event, I will see, you know, the new method that I created, select path right here. So it's available to me and to members of my team once I create it.